They thought he was just a barnhand, until the colonel stepped down from his horse, removed his hat, and said one word, "Sir." In a town where respect wore boots and spit tobacco, where a man's worth was measured by the color of his skin and the shine on his belt buckle, one figure moved through the morning shadows like a ghost. Quiet, steady, invisible. Ayana. Two Eagles didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The townspeople of Copper Ridge had already decided who he was. A nobody, just the Indian who shoveled their stables, hauled their feed, and knew better than to sit where decent folk took their coffee. He kept his head down, his hands calloused, his voice to himself. Not because he was weak, oh no, but because he'd seen enough of the world to know that sometimes silence is the strongest shield a man can wear. But that morning, something shifted. 3 men walked into the barn like they owned the sky. Thaddeus Crane with his smooth insults. Dutch Morrison, all sneer and sarcasm. Samuel Pike, the echo chamber. They kicked over the bucket Ayana had just filled, laughed like it was sport, called him boy, to remind him where he stood. And Ayana, he just kept working. Until the hoofbeats started. Not just any hoofbeats. Military. Purposeful. Heavy like judgment. When the barn doors swung open and a man in full blue uniform stepped inside, time stopped. His eyes scanned the room. He looked past the 3 laughing men, past the mess of grain, past the pitchfork in Ayana's hand. And then he removed his hat. You could have heard a pin drop. What the colonel said next would undo every assumption those men had made, not just about Ayana, but about themselves, about justice, and about what it truly means to be a man of worth in a country still haunted by its own shadows. This is not just a story about racism, not just a story about respect. It's about how power moves in silence, how dignity survives humiliation, and how one forgotten man could hold the fate of an entire town in his weathered hands. Stay with me, because once you hear who Ayana really is, you'll start questioning everyone you've ever overlooked. Every town has someone they look through. In Copper Ridge, that someone was Ayana. He came quietly about a year before the story begins. No grand entrance, no backstory offered. Just a tall, broad-shouldered native man with storm-weathered eyes and the kind of silence that made people uncomfortable. He asked no favors, took no pride, only asked if the barn needed tending. And so, Copper Ridge gave him the least desirable job in town. Cleaning stalls, mucking out manure, fixing broken doors no one else bothered with. For $1 a day, and even that half the time was forgotten. He never complained. They called him names they wouldn't dare write down. Chief when they were feeling clever, savage when they were feeling bold. But mostly they didn't call him anything, because to them he wasn't worth speaking to. What they didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was what this man had given up before he walked into their world. Every morning Ayana rose before the sun, his hands moving in rhythm with the breath of the land. Pitchfork in hay-spread feed, poured stalls cleaned. Horses seemed to trust him more than people did. He whispered to them in a tongue they didn't understand, but somehow recognized. And in that barn, among the dust and leather, and quiet, Ayana held space for himself. Not because he was weak, but because silence was safer than confrontation. Because in a town that measured manhood by loudness, cruelty, and money, Ayana's strength didn't make sense. Thaddeus Crane, the merchant who hired him, treated him with the smug indifference of a man who thinks kindness is a liability. Dutch Morrison, the saloon owner, liked to knock Ayana's water bucket over by accident. And Samuel Pike, the banker's son, was the kind who smiled to your face and spat on your boots as you turned. But Ayana endured. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because sometimes a man stays in a place that hurts because he's watching something, waiting for something, maybe testing something in himself, maybe testing something in them. And yet behind that quiet, behind the calloused hands and stitched shirt, lived a mind sharper than any of them imagined. A man who had read books they couldn't pronounce, who'd spoken in war rooms they'd never stepped foot in, who'd buried more brothers than these boys had ever called friends. But he said nothing. Not yet. Because sometimes the greatest storm comes not with thunder, but with a whisper waiting in the dark. And all it would take to awaken it was the sound of hooves at dawn, where we learn that even the smallest act of recognition, one word, one gesture, can rip a hole in a town's illusion of power. And the man they thought they owned had once commanded armies. The morning he arrived, the air in Copper Ridge changed. It started with the sound. Not just the thud of hooves, any ranch hand could tell you that sound, but the rhythm. Deliberate, heavy. Like every stride came with intent, not a traveler, not a trader. Military. The town's heartbeat skipped. Colonel Marcus Whitfield didn't ride in like a man looking to be noticed. He didn't need to. His pressed uniform, polished boots, and the silver insignia on his chest did the talking long before his mouth ever opened. This was a man who had given orders that moved battalions, not bar stools. The townsfolk stood straighter as he passed. Even the ones who'd been drinking since sunrise lowered their bottles. There's something about real authority. It doesn't shout. It doesn't strut. It just... Thaddeus Crane, the town's self-declared voice of reason, rushed to meet him like a child desperate for approval. "Colonel, welcome to Copper Ridge. Finest town this side of the territories," he puffed. Marcus didn't answer. His eyes were scanning, not for landmarks, for people. And then he saw the barn. A quiet man with darker skin stood inside, still tending to his morning work as he always did, same as yesterday, same as every day before. But something in Marcus's posture changed the moment their eyes met. And Ayana, for the first time, stood taller. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Recognition doesn't need words. The colonel stepped down from his horse and walked straight past Thaddeus, past Dutch Morrison's awkward grin, past Samuel Pike's stammering welcome toward the man none of them thought worth looking at. What happened next was not loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it shook Copper Ridge to its core. Colonel Whitfield removed his hat, held it at his side, and nodded. "Sir." One word. That's all it took to unravel months of cruelty, of assumptions, of silent abuse. One word spoken with respect, with truth. 3 men, merchants, barkeeps, bankers, stood frozen. Because if Ayana was sir, what did that make them? And Ayana. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked the colonel in the eye and said the first words he'd spoken aloud in that barn since he arrived. "I wondered when you'd find me." Because the thing about power is, it's not in the boots. It's not in the badges. It's in the way a man carries himself when he knows who he is. And the town of Copper Ridge had just realized that the man they'd been stepping over for a year had once stood at the center of maps they couldn't even read. Where secrets come to light, names gain weight, and we learn that history sometimes chooses silence, until silence must speak. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a gunshot. It was just one word. "Sir." But in that dusty barn, with sunlight slicing through cracks in the wood, it landed like thunder. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a man who commanded soldiers with a glance and silenced rooms with a single breath, had just called the town's barn Indian Sir. And not with sarcasm, not with mockery, with reverence, with weight. You could feel the air buckle under it. Thaddeus Crane's face drained of color. His lips moved, but no words came. Dutch Morrison gripped the barn rail, knuckles white. Samuel Pike stepped back so fast he nearly tripped over a feed bucket. Because up until that moment, they thought they knew who Ayana was. A man with a pitchfork, a hired hand. The one who never talked back, never raised his voice, never made eye contact unless spoken to. A background character in their little town. But now the story had changed. Ayana Two Eagles stood taller, not because he suddenly had power, but because the truth had always been there, quiet, patient, waiting. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look angry. His eyes were calm, steady. And that calm was terrifying. It's a strange thing, watching your own assumptions crumble. Thaddeus had built his entire sense of superiority on the belief that Ayana was beneath him, that he could walk into that barn, kick over a bucket, and the world would remain the same. But that one word shattered it, sir. It wasn't just a title. It was a mirror. It reflected every wrong joke, every muttered insult, every time they chose cruelty when kindness cost nothing. It reflected what they'd ignored: the depth in Ayana's silence, the precision in his work, the way he carried his pain like something sacred. Ayana finally met their eyes. And when he spoke, it wasn't to tear them down. It was simply truth. "I speak 7 languages," he said quietly. "I've sat at tables with generals and presidents. While you were counting pennies, I was counting the cost of peace." He wasn't bragging. He was offering a history they never cared to ask about. And in that moment, the barn wasn't just a place where hay was spread and horses were kept. It was a courtroom, a chapel, a place where reckoning arrived not with fire, but with stillness. Because sometimes the loudest shifts in the world don't come from noise. They come from recognition, from one word that says, "You were wrong. You misjudged. And now, it's time to see." Where honor is revealed not through uniform or flag, but through quiet scars and a single medal that forced 3 men to see the truth they'd tried so hard to ignore. He had always been there, in the background, in the barn, in the silence between footsteps. Ayana Two Eagles never asked for attention. He never told his story, not because it wasn't worth telling, but because no one ever asked. And in a town like Copper Ridge, silence was easier than being reminded again and again that your story didn't matter. But now, standing in a barn, thick with the dust of revelation, there was nowhere for the truth to hide. Colonel Whitfield didn't list accolades to impress. He spoke them as facts, as if trying to restore balance to a scale long tilted. This man, he said, prevented 3 wars, saved hundreds of lives, was awarded the Medal of Honor for walking into an Apache camp alone. No weapons, no backup. Just his voice, his presence, his history. Ayana didn't blink. He didn't shift under the weight of those words, because he had already lived them. What the men of Copper Ridge never knew was that Ayana had once been the bridge between 2 worlds. The U.S. Army had called him Chief Scout, not as a courtesy, but as recognition of his ability to read terrain, to read people, to read danger before it exploded. He'd translated not just words, but intent. He'd stood between generals and war chiefs, between vengeance and restraint. His reward: a chest full of scars and a nation still unsure whether to thank him or forget him. He chose obscurity not out of shame, but out of exhaustion, because what no one in Copper Ridge saw was what came after the peace talks, after the handshakes and photographs, after the troops pulled back and the treaties were signed. Ayana had to live with both sides, calling him traitor. Some Apaches said he'd sold out. Some soldiers never trusted a redskin, no matter how many lives he saved. So he walked away. To a barn, to silence, to routine. He found peace in pitchforks and hay, in horses who didn't care what language he spoke, in days measured not by missions, but by sunrise and feed buckets. And yet all it would have taken was a single question. "Who are you?" But no one asked. They called him boy, laughed at his accent, assumed he was simple. And still, Ayana showed up every morning, on time, with dignity, because character, he believed, didn't require an audience. That day in the barn, Ayana didn't raise his voice to shame anyone. He didn't throw the medal in their faces. He just stood. And in that quiet, the truth filled the space where ignorance used to live. Because the most tragic thing wasn't that they misjudged him. It's that they never cared to see him at all. And the heartbreaking ripple effects of one small town's everyday cruelty on a people who only wanted to be heard. There's a kind of savagery that doesn't carry knives or war paint. It wears polished boots. It shakes hands at church. It smiles while locking doors behind people it fears. In Copper Ridge, the townsfolk believed they were civilized. They said grace before meals and tipped their hats on Sundays. But somewhere along the way, decency became a costume and cruelty a quiet habit. Samuel Pike refused to sell grain to a pair of Apache scouts, said they looked dangerous. Never mind, they had money in their hands and peace in their intentions. Dutch Morrison kept a sign outside his shop. "We reserve the right to refuse service." No one said it outright, but everyone knew who that was meant for. And Thaddeus Crane, well, he didn't need a sign. His cold smile and condescending tone did the job just fine. Especially the night Ayana returned from a mission, mud still clinging to his boots, blood still drying on his sleeves from dragging a wounded settler out of a canyon, and Thaddeus refused to serve him a meal. "This isn't a charity," he'd said. As if Ayana had come to beg. They called him savage. But Ayana Two Eagles had saved more white families than most men in that town had even spoken to. He'd spoken 7 languages, brokered treaties that held entire regions together, and sat across from generals who trusted him with their soldiers' lives. But they never asked, never questioned why a man with calloused hands and quiet eyes seemed to carry so much sorrow beneath his silence. They just saw brown skin and assumed the rest. And that's the thing about ignorance. It's not just the absence of knowledge. It's the refusal to seek it. It's the comfort of a lie that says I am better because I do not have to understand you. When Ayana stepped forward in that barn and spoke not with anger but with clarity, he didn't just confront 3 men. He held up a mirror. "You call us savages," he said. "But which of us turned away hungry children? Which of us laughed at suffering? Which of us built walls around their compassion and called it law?" No one answered. Because in that moment they knew. The savage wasn't the man with feathers in his hair or earth on his skin. It was the one in clean boots who turned away from another human being because he dared to be different. And ignorance, that was the true wildness, the untamed thing left unchecked. Ayana never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the most powerful confrontation doesn't come from fury, but from truth spoken with calm certainty. A truth that doesn't ask for forgiveness, only recognition. And what Ayana left behind on a wooden beam in a quiet barn spoke louder than any sermon ever could. It was just a sack of grain. To Samuel Pike, that's all it ever was, barely worth the breath it took to say no. 2 Apache scouts had walked into his store, dusty from travel, quiet but respectful. They placed coins on the counter and gestured toward the grain sacks stacked against the wall. Samuel didn't ask questions, didn't care why they were there, didn't notice the exhaustion in their eyes or the tension in their shoulders that comes from carrying more than just a long journey. He just sneered, pushed their coins back, and said, "We don't serve your kind here." The scouts said nothing, just nodded once slowly, then turned and walked out. And that moment, silent, brief, unremarkable to the town of Copper Ridge, echoed farther than any of them could have imagined. Because those weren't just 2 wanderers, they were envoys, sent by Chief Standing Bear to extend one last hand of peace. Their mission had been clear trade with settlers, prove goodwill, build trust. But Samuel's refusal was louder than any insult. To the scouts, it was a door slammed in the face of diplomacy. To their people, it was confirmation that peace was a fool's dream. One small act of prejudice in a sleepy frontier town became the crack that split the ground open. And from that crack poured rage, fear, and a decision made far away under starlit canopies. If we are not welcome in their world, we will defend our own. 3 weeks later, settlements burned. Families fled into the night. And the same people who couldn't be bothered to sell food now cried out for soldiers, for saviors. That's when Colonel Whitfield came. And with him, Ayana Two Eagles. The irony was bitter. Ayana knew the scouts who had walked into Pike's store. He'd trained them himself, taught them English, helped them memorize maps, showed them how to speak gently, even when treated harshly. They had believed in peace, and they had died with that belief still in their hearts. When Ayana recounted this to the 3 townsmen, there was no rage in his voice, only grief. "You thought you were turning away beggars," he said. "But you were turning away hope." Thaddeus looked sick. Dutch couldn't meet his eyes. And Samuel finally understood the weight of what he'd done. Sometimes it isn't bullets or blades that start wars. Sometimes it's a closed heart, a careless word, a missed opportunity to see another human being, not as a threat, but as a bridge. Because in the great turning of history, it's rarely the grand gestures that decide the future. It's the small ones, the ones we don't think matter, until they do. And in a quiet barn, Ayana left behind 3 silver coins, not as a debt paid, but as a reminder that honest work deserves honest pay, and that every action, no matter how small, leaves a mark. They sat there, 3 simple coins, resting on the wooden rail, like forgotten truths finally spoken aloud. No ceremony, no speech, just a quiet gesture from a man who had carried his dignity in silence for far too long. Ayana Two Eagles didn't need their money. He had walked away from titles, from medals, from power greater than any of the 3 townsmen could fathom. But that morning, after everything, he laid down those coins, as if to say, "This is what fairness should have looked like. Even when you couldn't see me as worthy, I still earned this." Samuel Pike stared at the silver pieces like they might burn through the wood. "We never paid you," he whispered. "We never even offered." "I know," Ayana replied, voice low, steady. "But I did the work, and honest work deserves honest pay." It wasn't anger that colored his tone. It was something heavier, disappointment, without bitterness. That ache you feel when you've stopped expecting someone to do right, but still decide to show them what right looks like anyway. The coins weren't just payment. They were memory. They were mirror. They were mercy. Dutch Morrison blinked hard. Why leave them now? Ayana met his gaze not with fury, but with clarity. Because someday someone else will ask what kind of men you were. And when they do, I want you to be able to point to something real, something earned. There was a stillness in the barn that no one dared break. Even the horses seemed to understand the weight of that moment. 3 coins for a year's worth of labor and a lifetime's worth of silence. But it wasn't the value that mattered. It was the message. That dignity isn't given, it's lived. And when it's denied, it leaves a bruise deeper than fists ever could. Thaddeus Crane stepped forward, his voice rough and cracking like a man trying to learn a new language, one made of humility. "Please keep the money. It's the least we can do." "I don't want your money, Mr. Crane," Ayana said gently. "I want you to remember what it felt like to look at a man and see nothing, and then learn how wrong you were. It was the kind of wound that didn't bleed, but bled into you, slowly, deeply, permanently." And in that quiet space between guilt and grace, the townsmen began to understand that sometimes it's not the harshest punishment that leaves the deepest mark, but a small act of unspoken forgiveness. The silver gleamed softly in the golden light, and for the first time, they didn't look like coins at all. They looked like lessons. Ayana Two Eagles stepped into the morning light, leaving the barn and the men behind. But what he left in his wake wasn't silence, it was change. And like dust carried on the wind, it would settle slowly across the town of Copper Ridge, reshaping everything it touched. It didn't happen overnight. Towns like Copper Ridge don't change because of speeches or ceremonies. They change, if they ever do, because one morning someone gets up and does something different. A door stays open longer. A face once turned away holds eye contact. A silence that used to be filled with muttering turns into space for listening. After Ayana rode away, the town didn't erupt in applause or revolution. No one tore down statues or held parades, but something shifted, subtle quiet, like spring thaw beneath a stubborn winter. Thaddeus Crane removed the members-only sign from the front of his restaurant. He didn't say anything about it, just pulled out a ladder at sunrise, unscrewed the rusted bolts, and let it fall into the dirt. He didn't replace it with anything, just left the doorway open. Samuel Pike, whose hands had once scattered Ayana's grain, started offering a quiet greeting to the Apache scouts who rode into town. Not loud, not perfect, just enough to say, "I see you now, and I know your language matters." Dutch Morrison stopped standing in his doorway, arms crossed, scanning for trouble. One morning, someone noticed his rifle was no longer resting by the saloon door. Another, they saw him helping a Lakota woman carry water from the well. No one told them what to do. Ayana hadn't left a list. There was no grand reckoning, just the echo of his quiet voice and the weight of what they had seen in his eyes. Regret is a strange kind of fire. It doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it burns just hot enough to forge something new. And that's what began to grow in Copper Ridge. A new kind of town. One where children weren't taught to cross the street when a stranger passed, where the local paper started printing stories from all the territories, where a boy named Eli, who'd once been punished for speaking Apache at school, was asked to teach it instead. But the silver coins remained, sitting quietly on the mantel in Thaddeus's home untouched. Some nights he'd pick one up, feel its cool weight in his hand, and remember the man he'd tried not to see. The man who reminded him that sometimes the people we dismiss hold the wisdom we need most. Was it enough? Maybe not. But it was something. A start. Because towns don't find redemption in one grand gesture. They find it in the morning after shame. In the second chance offered, the apology stammered out, the hand extended where none was offered before. Ayana Two Eagles never returned to Copper Ridge. He didn't need to. His absence carried more weight than his presence ever had. And though his footprints faded from the dirt roads, his story didn't. It stayed in whispered conversations, in changed behaviors, in the way children were raised to look people in the eyes, especially the quiet ones. Because somewhere along the way, the town began to understand. Some legacies are not shouted, they're lived into being. No one knew where Ayana Two Eagles went after he rode out of Copper Ridge. Some said he returned to the southern territories to walk beneath canyon walls that had once echoed his people's songs. Others believed he sought out the scattered remnants of his tribe, offering stories and silence in equal measure. A few swore they saw him in New Mexico, standing beside a missionary school, watching from afar. But most stopped asking, because over time it didn't matter where he went. What mattered was what he left behind. His legacy didn't take the shape of a statue or street name. There was no holiday, no plaque nailed into a barn wall. He would have hated that kind of thing anyway. What he gave was less visible and far more enduring. It showed up in the way people started to speak with a pause before judgment, a softening of words. In the way young men once full of swagger now looked elders in the eye, searching for stories instead of dismissing them. The children changed first. They asked new questions. Why was Ayana never invited to town dinners? Why did Mr. Crane stop talking whenever an Apache passed by? Why didn't anyone thank him for fixing the schoolhouse roof after the storm? Their parents didn't always have good answers, but the questions stayed. And from them, seeds grew. The local school brought in a Lakota elder once a month to speak of traditions and memory. The church choir invited a Navajo mother to sing a song of mourning during the town's Remembrance Day. The sheriff's office, once indifferent, started documenting injustices that would have been ignored before, quietly maybe, but with intention. Ayana's name wasn't mentioned often, but he was felt. In the hush before a young storekeeper spoke. In the thoughtfulness behind a helping hand, extended without being asked. In the way the townsfolk began to see those they once passed by. And late at night, when the barn creaked under moonlight, some said they still felt his presence, as if the earth itself remembered the weight of his footsteps, the quiet pride of his labor. He became less a man, more a story passed down, reshaped, revered. A ghost not born of death, but of transformation. Proof that sometimes the softest voices leave the deepest echoes. Because the truth is, a legacy isn't what you take with you. It's what you leave burning in the hearts of those who watched you walk away. And Ayana left behind something no fire could consume: dignity reborn. Not in headlines or monuments, but in the daily decision to do better. To ask, to listen, to honor. Because in the end, we all become stories. And the only question that matters is when they tell. Yours, will it make someone else stand taller, speak softer, or love deeper? Ayana's did. And maybe, just maybe, ours can too. What would you have done if you'd been Samuel Pike behind the counter when two quiet strangers placed silver coins on your worn wooden counter? Would you have served them with respect? Or looked away, heart wrapped in fear and habit? If you'd been Thaddeus Crane watching a war hero sweep your floors, would you have asked his story or chuckled with the others and told yourself he probably had none worth telling? And if you'd stood in Ayana's place, carrying silence, heavier than steel honor, unrecognized and dignity denied, would you have still chosen grace? These are not questions of the past. They are questions for every generation. Because the truth is, the uniforms change, the languages shift, the names fade into dust. But the moment of choice remains the same. When you're faced with difference, do you turn away or do you lean in? When a voice is quiet, do you silence it further or do you make space for it to rise? When a person carries pain in their silence, do you assume or do you ask? Ayana Two Eagles didn't stay to witness the fruits of his grace. He left that to the people of Copper Ridge. Left it to us, in a way, to decide what we'll do with the stories we inherit, because we all inherit them, whether we realize it or not. Some of us carry privilege without understanding its weight. Others carry wounds still searching for a name. But all of us carry the power to choose differently. So perhaps the real legacy Ayana left behind wasn't the silver coins, not the quiet barn, not even the shift in the town. Maybe his legacy is the question he asked without ever saying it aloud. What kind of world will you build? Not with power, but with kindness. That's what remains. That's what echoes. And maybe that's why his story matters now more than ever. Because this isn't just about one man, one town, or one era. It's about us. Here. Now. So as we close this story, I'll ask you one final time, not as narrator, but as a fellow traveler. What would you have done? And more importantly, what will you do next? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the quiet power of doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Watch our next episode where a young settler girl gives her last blanket to a dying warrior and wakes up to find 200 riders at her door. Sometimes compassion speaks louder than cannons. Thank you for listening and for remembering.